Welcome to another episode of the UIBuzz.com podcast. In this episode, I am going to be talking about Unity. I'm going to tell you what it is, what it's used for, what it's good for, some of the things that maybe it's not so great for, and how you can get started with it. For those of you that don't know, it is mostly used for games, but you can use it for applications as well. So let's get started with the first question. So what is Unity? Unity is an application that you can use to develop and build games primarily, but it's also extremely useful for building applications. Lately you've been seeing a lot of work with Unity for, even the top sort of AAA games through to indie games. It's very popular for those kind of things. It is actually capable of doing virtual reality games as well and working with that hardware. And hopefully we're going to see some improvements over time for working with augmented reality. So that's what it is. It works on multiple platforms. In particular, I personally run it on Mac and Windows. And the nice thing about that is that if you use some kind of cloud sharing for your projects and your files, that it actually works for those cross-platform as well. So you can actually develop on multiple platforms the same application or project. So why use Unity over some of the other available tools? Well, certainly there are plenty of tools for developing applications and games. There are lots of other engines as well. And the reason that I like to use Unity is everything's built in and everything's right there. And if I need something extra, it has a built-in store with purchasable extensions. Assets is what they're actually called. But there's lots of free ones in there as well. So if I need some button graphics or, I need a particular script or whatever it may be, if I look in the store, I'll probably find it in there without even having to leave the application itself. And, Unity is one tool, but it really feels like it's an entire suite of tools built into one at the end of the day. And the reason I like to use it over the other tools is everything's right there. And depending on how you install it, I can compile it to any of the platforms that I need to compile it in. I can also test it in there as well. I can write my code. I can work with the assets. And it also uses its own built-in engine. So everything's just there in one tool. And that's primarily why I like to use Unity. And it's also a case of, rather than having to jump around multiple tools, just having that one tool and getting familiar with it, learning the shortcuts, the interface, the quirks of it as well, will make you more productive over time. So there are plenty of other options, but for me, Unity does everything I need, and that's why I use it. One of the big plus features of Unity is the ability to distribute to multiple platforms right there from your one code base. And I'm not talking about developing now. So I'm not talking about using it on Windows or Mac. I'm talking about when you've completed and you plan to distribute your game, for example. So I can come right there, depending on the options that I choose when I install it, I can go through and I can distribute, for example, to Linux, to Windows, to Mac, to the Nintendo Switch, to PlayStation, Xbox, iOS, Android. All these platforms are right there and supported. So I can write one game and distribute to all those platforms with no having to recode or very little work for specific platforms, which is just wonderful, right? I don't have to worry about, building something specifically for Windows or for iOS and it won't work on another platform. All these platforms are supported right there in Unity, which is a massive time saver. Think about it. You've got one code base you can distribute to multiple platforms. It's just fantastic. One of the other, what I would call big features of Unity is the price for the cost of entry. It's actually free. Now, it's not completely free. There are exceptions. You are free to use it to develop and distribute your projects. And if you use it under the free license, you will find that your applications or games will display a kind of Unity loading screen at the beginning for a couple of seconds. It's really not a huge deal. Now, you're free to essentially make money with this application or game that you've developed. But what you really should do is, if let's say it becomes really popular and you really start to make money with it, the right thing to do is to switch to a commercial license. Not only is it the honest thing to do, but it's kind of really, you should support the people that make your tools. Now, admittedly, Unity is not cheap, but to be honest, if you are making enough money that you can afford the license, it's really not going to be a problem for you. right? It's the same as everything else in my view. You know, if you want to become an Uber driver, well, you should have a pretty nice car, right? You know, these kind of things. You need to invest in you, and you need to invest in your tools so that your tool makers can make them better for you, which helps you out in the long run. So Unity is free to use, but if you are lucky enough to have something that becomes really successful, then you should do the right thing and get a commercial license. Let's talk about the actual writing of code now. Unity is designed in such a way that you can do a lot of what I would call drag and drop for development. But at the heart of it, of course, you're going to have to write code at some point. You're going to have to write the business logic for the game, right? The game rules, the player, monitoring, whatever it may be. Now, it used to be that there were a couple of different options in Unity. JavaScript was one of them. But these days, it's really C#. So you will be required to either know or learn C#, which really is not a bad programming language to learn, to be honest with you. It's pretty reasonably straightforward, I would say, pretty straightforward. There's a lot of resources out there, of course, and there's a massive development user base for C#. So you're pretty much going to find the answer for anything you need to find. I had done some C# before, but not in a big way. And I was pleasantly surprised once I started using it in Unity that I was able to draw from my experience with, JavaScript, Swift, and a lot of the other programming languages that I'd used before. So if you're familiar with kind of a type-safe language like C#, it's not going to be too much of a shift for you. And there's a lot of, like I say, helpful resources and a massive amount of Unity tutorials out there as well. Particularly on YouTube, there's a lot of good videos. So you can get up and running in the scripting in no time. Like I say, so C# is a huge plus, to know it beforehand. But if you don't, then it's fine. You're going to learn the C# that you need to use in Unity. You don't need to learn the entire C# language. Unity itself doesn't really have a code editor as such built in. If I remember rightly, there was something called Mono Edit or something like that in earlier versions of Unity, but it really doesn't have it built in now. Now you'll notice when you install Unity, one of the options is to install Visual Studio, the Community Edition, which you can certainly go ahead and do that. But personally, I prefer to take advantage of the tools that I'm already familiar with and I use. So I use Visual Studio Code, and I'll put a link in the show notes as to where you can get that. It's a free tool from Microsoft, and it's a great code editor because anything that you need, you can install plugins, sort of these extensions that will take care of that for you. And it also works, obviously being my Microsoft tool, great for C#. So you can configure in Unity, you can just tell it, use Visual Studio Code as my editor. Another option would be like for your Sublime Text is another one I use. So you can specify the preferences, whichever one you want to use. But personally, I recommend using Visual Studio Code with it. I just find that, once you learn the shortcuts and sort of the productivity tweaks that work for you with any particular code editor, it's just best to use that tool for as many things as you can. And since this works so beautifully with Unity, that's why I like to use it. So for example, I get the C# solution opens up in Visual Studio Code. I can edit the code and save it there. And when I go back to Unity, Unity is going to see that the code has changed. It's going to recompile it all, check it for errors and everything else. Plus, I get to take advantage of the features like source control and syntax checking and highlighting and everything else. IntelliSense works with it as well over in Visual Studio Code. So that's my recommendation for a code editor. Let's talk about some of the potential downsides. So one of them is that Unity doesn't have a way for you to really edit assets, things like graphics and audio directly inside the Unity application, which actually is a good thing. So you'll need to continue to use third-party tools for generating and editing those assets. So for example, any of the standard graphics editors for editing your sprites, your graphics, your game pieces, if you like, or UI pieces, audio editors for working with your audio before you bring it into the application. Of course, in Unity, you can work with those, assets using filters, be them audio or visual or anything else. but you're really going to have to generate those assets and animations outside of Unity first. Now, Unity does have a fantastic animation system, but you just need to make sure that you have everything in place that you need as you bring it in. It does a lot of round tripping, which is, you import an asset into Unity, let's say a graphic, for example, and then you need to change it. Well, you can just edit in the application that you used to create the graphic, and Unity is going to pick up on that, and it'll just, assuming you've saved it as the same file, it'll just can start working with the new file. So you sort of have that round tripping, as it's called. So that's one potential downside. Another downside, if you're not careful, can be updating Unity too often. Now, that may sound kind of weird. Unity developers and the company are great at releasing updates. They do it on a regular basis. Now, the problem there is that some of them can be, breaking existing systems. They may break existing code or things that you've built. There's a way around that, though. So I really don't recommend sort of the cutting edge, every release, unless you're super early in a project. They have what's called the LTS system, and what that stands for is the long-term support. So you're going to find that there'll be a version, for example, right now there's a 2018 version that's called LTS. And what that means is that they'll continue to support that version, but it's not going to have, all of the sort of earth-shattering new cutting-edge features that may cause you problems, or they may be so new that they're not really baked in and the APIs may continue to change and that kind of thing. This has caught me out a couple of times in the past with some extensions that I have used. So I recommend for long-term big projects that you really look to use the LTS releases. You can have multiple versions installed. So for example, you could use the LTS to develop your project, whatever it may be, and continue to install the cutting edge releases to see what's coming down the pipe, right? See potential features that you might use in the future, or just out of curiosity, want to play around with some of the newer things and prepare ahead of time. So that's something that I consider a downside, but thanks to this multiple install option, it's something that you can easily get around. So lastly, is Unity for you? Well, that's really for you to decide. And since the barrier for entry is free, you can just go to unity.com and download it and try it out. And that's what I recommend. I would say that if you're looking to create a 2D or 3D game, and in particular to launch it on multiple platforms, you really should give Unity a try and give it a look. And even if you just use it for prototyping, because it's so fast to work with, it is a great way to prototype games and see if people are even interested in the game before you really deep dive into the development. So like I say, go to unity.com, try it out for yourself. But I really recommend, for those of you who may be new into the game development, it's a great way to get started. It's certainly one of the easier options compared to many of the other game engines out there like Unreal and that kind of thing. And certainly if you're new to code, I think it's going to be an uphill struggle for you regardless of platform. But if you're reasonably new to code, I think Unity is a good way to go to get into the C# and start working with it. So that's it. If this has been helpful, go to UIBuzz.com, let me know, or reach out to me on Twitter at UIBuzz. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you use Unity? What do you think of it? Let me know. And that's it. I will speak to you next time.